Welcome everybody to another episode of Apocalypse Here podcast. And we're excited to be doing another episode. This is going to be another one that we're going to be mainly focusing on the book, John's new book coming out, Beyond Justification, Liberating Paul's Gospel. So we're going to be touching on chapter 3 at this point. We've made it through. If you go back, you can see some of our other episodes. We made it through the first two chapters. And this is a really exciting one. It's kind of the last chapter in like the section before it gets to a little bit more technical kind of stuff. I feel like it's like there's the first three chapters where the real good stuff, kind of getting at what the gospel is and whatnot in the beginning. So I'm excited for this one. But before we get started, I just want to mention mention what we're doing. We have a few questions from Twitter. We'll hit at the end of this episode, and we have a cool announcement of the cover art that we'll do. But before we get started with that, we're going to play our little intro and kind of let people trickle in while we're live. But we'll be right back after our intro plays.
Like David said, is this all just from the fruit? All my trying to be normal has just proved too hard to do. It's easy to say that the cross is at the front when the bookends are so violent compared to the selfless son. But I've tried to be, and I've tried to see like him. I'm glad it's not my faith that I've seen your face, 'cause that's slim. Like Eli said, I wish I didn't care. I've been trying to understand you, but it just seems like you aren't there. I contradict. I'm a walking yes and no. I say that I am either, 'cause I identify with both. But I've tried to be, and I've tried to see like him. I'm glad it's not.
We're cool. We're back. But so before we get started, I don't know if John wants to say anything at the top of the show, just any sort of notes he has or anything he wants to say. But I think we're pretty much ready to start. But if he wants to say anything,
Oh yeah, I mean it's been cool to talk about the first couple of chapters, and I'm looking forward to getting into the third one. It's a bit longer, as we were talking about a little bit before the stream. It might be one of the longest chapters. So this chapter is on sort of Paul's account of salvation. What Paul is doing with salvation. And as we're going to kind of see, it's what I think Paul is really, I think it also Douglas thinks Paul is talking about when he's talking about being saved. It's going to look a bit different than I think, especially Protestants have really understood for a while now, right? So let's reveal the cover. Hold on.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know if you have a picture.
I've got it.
To pull up. Yeah, okay. I know you definitely have it.
This is going to be the cover of the book.
Yeah, so John was showing me this. I think it's really, really cool. I know he's super excited about it.
Well, it's going to be the cover art on the book, not the entire cover, because we'll obviously have the title, our names, and all that. But this is going to be the
just
the
a picture
art. Yeah, it's just this. Yeah.
All
right,
boom. Nice.
Bring it on. Yep. So this is done by a great artist who just happens to be the wife of Douglas Campbell. This is Rachel Campbell's original artwork. And for those of you who have seen Douglas's other books, especially Deliverance of God, Framing Paul, and also the first release of The Quest for Paul's Gospel, Rachel did the art for those as well. And so there's a similar kind of theme, especially with Deliverance of God. So in terms of the words, obviously what's going to be important for our account of Paul is going to be participation in Christ, which we'll talk about quite a bit more. Resurrection is going to be key, and we're going to talk about that today, I'm sure. Resurrection. Freedom, being set free. Backward. So this might be a little bit of a weird word, but you may have noticed that I talk a lot about stuff, understanding theological concepts in the light of Christ. So it's thinking back in the light of Christ. So backward is referring to that. And what's truth is there because what's revealed when I talk about in the light of Christ, what's revealed in Christ, what's self-revealed by God is the truth about who God actually is. So that stands at the center of what this book is all about, which is what we talked about in chapter 1, and then going into chapter 2, obviously God's love, which we talked about last time with Douglas. That's a key feature of our book as well. And then, as you notice, the text is flipped and it's going backwards, but it says forwards, right? So what we're going to get into is this kind of other account of the gospel that works from a sort of initial human plight toward a gospel solution. So it works forwards, but we have it backward to kind of suggest this is not what we're saying. And then part of that account of the gospel is legalistic. This comes from Paul's opponents that we'll end up talking about quite a bit. And then hell as well, because this is kind of what Paul's opponents are preaching as well, that the negative side of not following Torah, of not following this kind of other account of the gospel that they're preaching leads to death in hell, really. Obviously, there is a constructive account of hell, but the reason why we put this in there is to kind of connect Paul's opponent's gospel to this end. And then there's going to be room, ultimately, which I quite like ending with the word hell, because we have a sequel in mind that has to do with issues of, universalism, hell, all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of explaining why we have all these words here. And it starts off kind of bright up top and then moves and gets a bit darker at the bottom. So that's kind of the rationale behind it. And I love it. It actually reminds me a lot of Eric Carle. Do you know Eric Carle? You wrote Hungry Caterpillar.
What is his thing?
Hungry Caterpillar.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It has that similar kind of vibe, and I just love that kind of style of art. So yeah, this is going to be the cover art.
Brown bear. What do you see?
Yeah. Yeah, I just love it. Rachel did a great job, and I'm just super proud of it, and thankful to her for doing this when she's a busy artist herself. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I really like it, and I think it's really cool how it's like I was telling John, like it's like a picture, and then you look more at it, you're like, oh, there's all these words that relate, and then you realize like everything like obviously is there for a reason, and like you said, even I didn't even realize like the whole bottom part being written backwards, there's just a lot to it. It's really cool, and the more you look at something like that, the more you see, and more kind of reasons behind all of it kind of come out and stuff. I think that's really cool. So yeah, and Nick Quint has a comment there. Is that the cover of the revision of Deliverance of God?
Yeah,
footnotes instead.
He had a good joke on my Facebook for the 4-volume updated.
Yeah.
It's now.
I was gonna say it was like the cover of another volume of Church Dogmatics that they recently found or something.
Yeah, it's now 3,000 words.
Yeah.
Or 3,000 pages, not words. 3,000 pages, and it's more accessible now in that big form. So pick up all of those volumes when we release them. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's really cool. Glad we got to share it here.
Yeah,
me too. Really cool. It's really cool to see kind of all this stuff coming together and whatnot. This seems like this is like the fun part as you're finally done and stuff starts coming together. It's just kind of cool, and it's a lot less stress and trying to get things in and whatnot. It's more of the fun stuff.
Yeah, and I was talking to you earlier today, Ethan, about like I've been so like my relationship with the manuscript itself, like in the past several months, has been like trying to like pick out mistakes and all of that. And only recently have I been able to actually like step back and read the thing, and it's like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty good.
Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
this.
And I've been enjoying like going through it slow. I definitely like it's the type of book you definitely could just like keep reading, but I think it's really cool kind of like really going through it and then like reading a chapter and talking about it and whatnot. This has been, and then like having Doug on with the last one was really cool. So
Yeah, and we'll have him on more.
For sure.
He's just not quite as available as we are.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
It gets close to his bedtime around this time. So
I mean, it's close to my bedtime, to be fair.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, so like we mentioned, oh yeah, and I said at the start, we have a few questions from Twitter, and if anybody in the chat has any questions for us, you can leave them. We'll get them to those at the end. But we're gonna try and just sort of focus on the chapter, like we said. We're gonna try and keep these episodes a little bit shorter, a little more concise, but nothing crazy or anything, but just more than our, like we just did an episode with Adeline. I'm so terrible at saying names. I still like
Adelaide,
confident in how I say his name, but
Yep.
he was really cool. We just did an episode with him and Elvira were on last time. It was pretty long, but it was a really fun conversation.
It was really fun.
And so if you haven't seen that, you can check it out. We got into some stuff we don't normally talk about on the podcast, and we'll definitely have him on some more. He kind of brings a similar but different perspective, so that's been nice. But yeah, so this one, like we said, we're going to try and focus on chapter 3 of the book, and like you mentioned, the chapter is called God's Salvation. And yeah, it's really just Paul's account of salvation. And I was telling John, we'll start kind of, I think the place to kind of start out is if John could just kind of give a summary of like, what is your goal in this chapter? I think is like a good way to frame it, because you're not, you talk about things a little bit differently than like a typical just like evangelical account of salvation. And that's obviously intentional. And you guys are getting at something a bit different, which is why you basically wrote the entire book, to understand the gospel. But as far as more specifically this chapter about salvation, kind of what are you getting at? Could you kind of point out where you intentionally kind of did things a bit different than a lot of people will describe this topic and whatnot like that?
Sure. I mean, the preceding chapters are key, right? They're really key because we begin with the truth question. So we're trying throughout this, we're really trying to pay attention to sort of dogmatic order. So we begin with the truth question, and then so that's sort of that gets at the how of things. How do we know the truth about God? And then chapter 2, God's love, is really about the who is actually who is God, really fundamentally. What is being self-revealed there about this God and who this God is? And it turns out it's a God of love who has been purposing his creation and has elected all of the cosmos to be in fellowship with him through the Spirit and in Christ. So that kind of sets the stage for this. So if we have that in place, what we can do now is finally talk about what's getting in the way of God's purposes, right? Because you don't want to start there. And I think a lot of accounts of salvation in Paul's gospel begin with the problem. They start off with the human plight, right? So we're wanting to kind of shift that away. And so we have 2 chapters that kind of really give us a lot of the good stuff, and then say, okay, well, clearly stuff isn't the way it's supposed to be. There is something obvious about this. Not completely obvious, but we can look around and see death, decay, violence, all of this sort of stuff in the world. So there's something off, right? How do we make sense of that? And Paul has an account of what's gone wrong. And so in the beginning of this chapter, we do talk about the problem. But because we have those preceding chapters, excuse me, before even talking about the problem, because we have the preceding chapters, we're starting off with God's yes, God's fundamental yes to humanity. It's fundamentally positive all the way through, right? Only in the light of that, in the light of God's yes in Jesus Christ, can we talk about and really fully understand the problem that we're involved with. So it's intentional to structure it that way because I think that's the right theological order. And I just think that's how Paul thinks about things. He's thinking about stuff in the light of Christ, taking everything captive to Christ, all of our thinking captive to him. So that's an intentional kind of Pauline move. And that's to kind of contrast that. I mentioned it, but to kind of get a bit deeper into how this contrasts with other kind of approaches is you begin with, oh, we have a problem. We sin. We've screwed up. We've broken God's law. And God is really, really pissed at us for that. That's the first word you hear. You hear a no up front, right? And then eventually you come to a yes, but that yes has been kind of absorbed within the no. It's a small yes, and it's only a yes for certain people, right? Within the kind of broader no. What we're saying is it's the opposite way around. We start with God's yes up front. There is a no, and that needs to be heard, but it's a no not against a certain group of people. It's a no against sin, death, the flesh, the powers, all of that. So there is a no, and it needs to be heard, and we are held accountable for our collaboration with all of these negative kind of forces that are around and that are kind of pressing in on us and harming us. But the most important word is going to be the yes. And in fact, when we get to the end of the chapter on salvation, it's the yes that wins. It's the yes, the initial yes, that pulls it back on track, that pulls God's purposes back on track, ultimately.
Yeah, no, that's really, really good. I really appreciate, like starting with, starting with the yes is like what we've been kind of getting at in the, like you mentioned, that's like how you've laid it out in the first few chapters. Like God's love is obviously his yes, like this positive, relationship towards his creation. And while, like you said, like we look out, we see the problem. So there is this no that we have to recognize and understand, and be thankful that God is saying no to these evil things, that we know that he is not going to let this just go on forever. But I think it's really important, like you said, so to contrast this with like how other people want to start with the no, and they'll want to frame it in a way where like the reason, I think what kind of hit me is a lot of people will like describe salvation in a way where it's like, because you heard the no so loud is why you like responded to the gospel, right? Like people want to say like, oh, I just realized my sin was like so bad that my only option, and I like bowed the knee basically and accepted Jesus or whatever, however they want to frame it. And I don't even want to, because I mean, obviously more theological evangelicals obviously speak about how there's issues with that whole frame, but accepting Jesus. So I'm not trying to really get at that, but you know what I mean? I think they really frame it in a way where it's the no that is like doing the work, I think. And I really appreciate how you guys are framing it in such a way where that it's basically the exact opposite of that. That God is saying no, and we hear that and we know that, but that's not what does the work for us. Basically, it's
Right.
it's the resurrection, it's the good things, it's the
That's
life
right.
that we are drawn into, not this like death that we run away from.
That's right. Yeah. So it just to put it kind of simply, it's the gospel that I see in Paul and that Douglas sees in Paul is that there's a yes, a large yes, and then there's a small no. And in a lot of other accounts of the gospel, it's the no that's kind of the primary thing, and then there's a small yes within that for certain people who have faith in this process. Everyone else kind of gets either wiped out or eternally tormented. So yeah, that's really the difference, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then as I'm like just kind of skimming through as you're talking, you get into a section about sin, and I think this is something I've learned from you guys that's super important. That's really helped my thinking too. And like, I mean, maybe you could just kind of talk about this a little bit. The way you kind of like frame it as like sin, yes, it's like a thing we do, sure, that can be a sin, but really the problem that Paul is talking about is something much larger, something
Yeah,
much
yeah.
much more powerful than just, these like lapses in judgment or simple mistakes, or even just on things we do on purpose, but just that are bad or whatever. But there's a lot more to it than that, I think, that Paul's getting at. And
Yeah,
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 I think
yeah.
you guys hit on a lot of really good stuff. And if you could just mention like how, oh, you can go ahead. There's one part at the end where you guys talk about how like people tend to because you go ahead. I don't want, I'm like skipping ahead. You can
No,
go.
no, no, you're fine. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where I think uh, my Calvinism comes through a bit, just a little bit. Um, there, there is some like the problem that we're confronted with, and one of the ways that Paul talks about the problem is in terms of sin. And I think talking about sin in terms of like capital S sin, like it's a power that exerts some kind of like force on the cosmos and on people, and it harms and damages them, and it enslaves, right? And it damages our capacity to understand even what we're involved with. So the whole idea that we can really understand the plight that we're in while we're in it is nonsense to me. Yeah, maybe we have a certain like some kind of sense that something's not right, but to really understand the severity of what we're involved with, and that the radical reality of, or really strictly speaking, non-reality of what's going on, because the real is God in Christ, but the radicalness, the radicality of this, the only way that we can understand that is as we're being set free from it, right? So this is why the point about thinking backward in the light of Christ is so important. But when we do that, we can see that we're enslaved to sin. It's not just missteps that we make. It's not just transgressions, although those are in play, but those are just our collaboration with that enslaving construct, right? It's not like we're choosing between different options, and sometimes we choose the bad thing and sometimes we choose the right thing. That's too naive. That's too simplistic. We don't operate that way. And I think Paul in Romans 7 is explaining exactly why that can't be the case. Because when we want to do the thing that is good, we don't do it because we can't. We're too enslaved. We're too damaged. We're too harmed. We need to be released. Thanks be to God that we are. So yeah, I think giving a really radical account of sin is really, really important. And I think, as we touch on in the chapter, I think Paul's opponents, especially in Romans, Galatians, and Philippians, have a much more kind of optimistic account of the problem, where you can sort of, as you continue to sort of be trained in the Torah, you can kind of quell these desires, lusts, these ways in which we're collaborating with sin and death, flesh, all of that. And then you're good. You're good to go. You can respond to Christ, all of that. And Paul's like, well, no, like that doesn't actually help us. We're too sinful to be able to do that on our own. We can't just choose to do that. And for that to just sort of work out. So yeah, we're sort of, as Doug would say, dilapidated Bardian Calvinists on this. And I think Paul is really getting at this, I think, with his account of sin.
Yeah, I think in like a practical sense, as I was like reading through this and thinking about this idea again, it makes a lot of sense to me of like, it's one thing, right? Like you do something and like you realize it was wrong and you kind of like, okay, well that was a sin or whatever, right? Like, and you work to try and stop, and maybe you continue to do it, you do it again or whatever. But like this account of sin, I think makes much more sense of, because with that idea, if you're more focused on sin as like these things you knowingly do wrong, it kind of gets confusing with like unintentional sins and like things you do that you don't quite realize were wrong, but then you realize like, oh, this was actually causing like tons of damage, and like, should I have realized it was wrong, and like, or was there no way for me? Am I responsible for that because I was? But like with this account of sin being like this power that we're just like enslaved to, it makes a lot more sense. It puts everything in the same category, even since we're not realizing that we're colluding with the powers of evil, and what it's all in the same category. I mean, while obviously, like, you're not gonna, there is a difference between someone knowingly does wrong, but that's kind of on our level, I think. But as far as God's concerned, it's all colluding with sin and death and evil, and it's all in the same category. And I think that makes a lot more sense to kind of keep things. I mean, I guess it's like less ad hoc or whatever. You're not just like inventing new categories. Where, like, yeah, if you're just, it gets confusing for me. I've like in like Bible studies and when like you talk to people, like small groups where I've had friends and we're like doing stuff like this, and you think about like things you didn't realize. These like unintentional sins. It gets confusing, like how much of that in my response. It's weird. It kind of gets, is that a sin, to like do something if you didn't know it was actually wrong, or and like, but this is, yeah, I think, like I said, it's just a lot, it makes a lot more sense of reality, I think, to kind of keep things together and realize that like we're all enslaved to this evil, and it takes control even when we don't realize it. And we should be thankful, and it makes a lot more sense. We're thankful when we realize things are wrong. That's a good thing. It's not, yeah, it's just, I don't know. I think this is really a much healthier way to think about things, and I don't think it like lets people. I think some people may hear that and like, oh, what are you saying? Like, no one's responsible for the things they do wrong, and that's not at all what you're getting at. But yeah, I just think it's a lot more practical and makes. I think a lot of these ideas, like, it just starts to make a lot more sense of what we see actually in the world. It's a lot more concrete, is a word that I've been liking to use a lot.
Yep, you're exactly right. Yeah.
But to move on a little bit, then it gets into the section about sin must die. I think this is a really good thing. Like, you really explain, like,
oh yeah, okay,
yeah, like kind of what are you kind of getting at here? I think you do. It's a kind of a shorter section, but it's really, really important to kind of wrap people's heads around it. Really, like, made sense. My big takeaway from this just is that, like, you kind of put things on, like, there's certain things that aren't needing to be terminated. There's a problem, and God is going to fix it. And there's things that are the good, the yes. And so, yeah, if you could kind of give a little summary of that.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to get at here is that given that sin, death, flesh, all that stuff is enslaving and really decaying our existence, is that the only initial kind of way to deal with that is for it to die, right? It needs to go away, this negative stuff. And in fact, I think for Paul, this is just where it's headed. As he'll say, the wages of sin is death. That doesn't mean that, it doesn't say God is the penalty for sin is death, and God is going to kill you for collaborating with death. It means that what's being paid out by death, the result of death is going to, or the result of sin is actually just going to be death. I think that's basically what Paul is getting at with that. And Susan Eastman helped me kind of see that, as well as Doug, but she's really big on that kind of point, that that's what's being paid out is from sin, by sin, is death. That's just going to be the result of it. And that's a really important corrective to this idea that we need to be killed because we're sinful or something like that. I don't think that's at all what Paul is saying. Anywhere. I don't see Paul doing that anywhere.
It's just, you're right. It makes a lot more, like we've continued to say, it just makes a lot more sense of what is actually being said. Like, sin gets death. That's it.
That's where it's going.
Really, and not sinful people or people who committed sin.
Well, we do die though, because we're involved in this.
But
but we're not.
Yeah, so I guess that leads us into
it's not a retributive punishment against us by God. God isn't actively sort of punishing us. It's just the fact that sin has taken up residence in our flesh. Sin and death have taken up residence in the way that we're constructed. We kind of have to die, and that sucks. And that's not on the face of it, it's not a good thing, because this isn't how things should be. But it's it's just going to happen for every single one of us. We are going to, and we have to die, right? So that's kind of what we're getting at with that little section. Now, when we talk about Christ in this, what happens?
Resurrection.
Christ assumes
Okay.
all of this stuff that we're involved with. Christ takes it on himself. He becomes part of this. He comes in the likeness of human flesh. And it's not a perfected flesh for Paul. It is the fallen flesh that we're a part of. So God comes all the way down to become as close as possible to us in our fallen condition, in this condition that's just going to lead to death. Okay? And he gets executed on the cross, right? What happens there, though, is crucial. When Christ dies, his flesh is dead and buried, right? The flesh that he's assumed, this human flesh, is dead and buried. It's terminated at that point. And we're a part of this because, thankfully God, through God's Spirit, has connected us to this as well. So it's not just that Christ in his death on the cross and in his burial, it's not just that he does that and we're kind of standing apart from it and have to get linked up to it. It's that when Christ dies, the Holy Spirit has already grafted us onto that. So our flesh and the ways in which we're involved in this negative construct that is harming us, that gets terminated too. That gets done away with as well. Right? So that's important. And we can talk about the scope of that as well. if we want to.
Yeah. Just want to make note. You make a really good point. You use that where you bring up where you're talking about the incarnation and like God condescending down and how like we tend to think about, and you use like a C.S. Lewis quote in this little section, and I really like it was something important to think about. It's not like something like new information, but it's really like a really great thing to like be reminded of how like I mean I think in our minds a lot of times we tend to think like, because it is a good analogy, but like God being like an author and like entering into the story. But when we do that, I think we tend to think like if we're an author, we enter in as like the main character. It's like, yeah, we enter into this like limited world, but we're still like a person here and then a person there, but like God condescending down is so much more. Like the C.S. Lewis quote talks about something about like God being, I don't have it right there, but God being like a slug or a bug or whatever, it's like so much lower. And I think it was just a like good thing to think about it. I really appreciated that because it's not, like I said, it's like, I think a better analogy instead of like just a person entering in as like a little bit like more limited person, it would be like us entering in. You mentioned like the hungry caterpillar, right? It'd be like us entering in a story like that, very simplified, limited, super less than what we were. And I think it's just important to it's like a lot of times I think people want to run away from a lot of like, especially, and I know we're not talking about universalism here, but a lot of this like language you want to get, it's very like confident in like God, what God's going to do. And like God is going to, and I think they want to act like, and you guys make a point of that. Like God, it's all from God's free choice to do this. I don't know. I'm like a little bit rambling where I'm getting it, but I think it's just like really good to understand, like to be reminded of how much God really is giving up to do this and how thankful we can actually be for these things. It's not just like, a math problem where God makes this and then we know he's going to save us, that a lot of people want to accuse more like universalist or more, I don't want to say progressive or whatever, liberal and whatever, like people will frame it in that way. Like, oh, you don't realize how bad we really are or whatever. I don't know. It really was refreshing to hear some of this language repeated like in a more healthy way, I guess, like in your understanding of the gospel, which I think is more not only like a better and more healthy way, but more closely tied to what Paul is actually getting at. But to be reminded of some of these things that are important to remember. I don't know. Yeah, a little bit of a ramble, but I think I just wanted to make a note of that. I really appreciated that part before we get into the whole section on scope.
Thank you for that. I think it's something to kind of chew on a bit. Is that there is a sense in which we can talk about this in terms of God's choice, but it's also kind of not, right? Because the moment we introduce choice, there's a lot of stuff that could be kind of smuggled in, right? We could be smuggling in sort of libertarian free will, which I don't want to do with God. That doesn't really make any sense, especially not in Paul's understanding of God and how God kind of relates to the world. But
it's also not a math problem, right?
It's
not like God does this, so he's a robot and he must save us and stuff.
Right. I think one thing that Paul doesn't say explicitly, but I think it can open up certain avenues, and even with the previous chapter we were talking about with election, is that God's being, let me put it this way, God is who God is in his election of humanity. That's where we see what God is really like. There is no God behind or beyond that God. There is no possible world besides this one that God has chosen to create and to elect, right? So we're completely shutting off sort of Leibniz's stuff about possible worlds, right? Just for those who are watching this, who might be philosophically minded. What we're saying is this sort of God, this sort of revealing God, self-revealing God, this sort of electing God, in that election, in that activity of electing and revealing and self-revealing, right? This is where we see the being of God and nowhere else. That's important. That's really, really important, because that means that we can look to Jesus confidently and say, yeah, this is what God is really like, right? So in terms of like, could God have other choices or whatever, that's completely beside the point, I think, for somebody like Paul. I think for later really good interpreters of Paul, is that this is just how God is really like. God is the sort of God who offers up his child to die for us and to fully reconcile all of the cosmos back to God's self, and ultimately aim toward the purpose of the total reconciliation of the cosmos, where God will be all in all. That is who God is. There is no other God.
So like in a more simplified, like just straight to the point, like basically what you're kind of saying is that in another possible world where God chose different things, that doesn't exist, because that
would have to be a different God.
That would be a different God.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I was going to. Yeah. It wouldn't be a different world. Like, it wouldn't be God making a different choice. It would be a different God.
That's exactly
because God is the one who makes this choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's it.
God is who God is in this act of relating and electing and creating. There is no other God besides that one I think for Christians.
And
although,
I think
you're going to get Thomas who are going to be like, oh, but there's a difference between, essence and existence. And it's like, I don't have time for that. That's not like, I just don't.
Yeah. Or
I don't
like
see
with that. Is that where like the whole essence energy distinction could possibly come in with? Like,
sure. And like, I just I don't see that. That's not a helpful way of sort of theologically thinking in relation to somebody like
if
Paul.
It seems to me that if there is this distinction, it would mean that we have, and I guess that's what they're going to want to say, that's where the whole like apophatic but we have no access to that next level or whatever.
And
to say
like,
that there's something out there
is
that
no other level.
And to say there's something out there that exists about God that we have absolutely zero access to, I just don't see where you're getting. You'd have to show me where you're getting that from and like why. I don't.
I mean, it's philosophical.
Why do I even care at that point? To be honest,
And
this is where I have zero access.
this is where your emphasis, as you brought up, on sort of concreteness is important, right? So I think for Christians, we need to, I think, opt for sort of the concrete rather than the sort of abstract sort of stuff.
And even if, to me, I guess, like, just to end it all, even if that does exist, like, I want to focus as a Christian on the place that God has chosen to reveal to us. Like, why speculate about this thing that we don't have access to when he showed us who he is in Jesus? And Jesus isn't some like person walking around with like something, like all this crazy stuff going on that we don't see, I don't know. It just seems a lot more.
God, I mean, to put things in the sort of Robert Jensen ways, that like we know God God is who God is in the lived history of Jesus of Nazareth. That is who God is. That's God.
And that's it.
Wild. I mean, it's an innovative thing to say, especially with the sort of background of sort of Christian metaphysics, but I think that's basically right. I would want to nuance that in certain ways, but yeah, God is who God is in that lived history. Yeah.
Which is, it really is a crazy thing to think about, that, like, and that's why, really, like, God is a first century Jewish preacher who got crucified on a cross. It's very, I don't know. This is definitely a rabbit trail that
it is, but I mean, it's important.
Yeah, it's very important
for this. I mean, it's important for understanding salvation as well. It's not that God is, I mean, we need to be careful to not think about God as something that's just simply external to us, that's doing work apart from us. So this is where like alternative accounts of sort of salvation can come in, where there's sort of a there's some sort of like transaction happening between God the Father, God the Son, right out there, and then we can kind of buy into that through faith. The idea here is that no, God comes down to us, and then we're included in that intimately and concretely, and that's how we're saved, right? So the sort of closeness is really, really important, and I think we need to kind of hold on to this, because I think this is where Paul is going to. So just
I mean, there's so many things we could talk about here, but so you kind of so I think to kind of, I feel like we went down a rabbit trail there. Wanting to say more, and I'm trying to stop myself, so I'm trying to get back on track a little bit here. But to kind of end this chapter off is where you really start so you get into the whole idea of resurrection, and kind of I think the important thing here that I'm like really is something I'm obviously is the hardest part of all this, I guess, is like kind of the overlap of the ages that we've talked about, like we've mentioned with J. Lou Martin talks about the ages, language, and stuff. But just like the fact that in a sense we are resurrected now, we have died with Christ now, but obviously I'm sitting here, I can tell you I've never experienced death, but in a sense I have. So it's this is where it's difficult, but I think it's important to try, because this is what Paul talks about, the whole participation, which you have on your cover. Like, we are participating, and we have participated now, but it's just difficult, I guess, for me to really, obviously, I don't think anybody really fully wraps their head around this, but this is just where I struggle to put words to. I feel like I can understand it in my mind a little better than I can put words to, and I really appreciated how you guys did. And this is like one section that I will definitely go back to. But I don't know, I didn't really have a question there, but I don't know if you want to kind of just to kind of end this chapter off, talk a little bit about resurrection, the whole mind of Christ language that you use towards the end, how we in one sense are still in the flesh, but in one sense are seated in heaven with Christ, basically.
Right. The way that Paul kind of deals with this overlap is in terms of he introduces this concept of having a new mind. So obviously we're still in bodies constructed of flesh, and we can still constantly sort of lapse into sinful behavior. We can continue on in that way, but we don't have to. And this is kind of the basis of Paul's ethics, is that we have new minds. In fact, we have Christ's mind, and not just any Christ's mind. We have the resurrected Christ mind within us. So that's Paul's way of kind of getting at this overlap, is that yes, while we're still in kind of the muck and the mire of Adam, we're also being informed by Christ and his resurrected mind. So we can act ethically because we have that mind. We don't have the soma pneumaticon. We don't have the resurrected body yet. We'll get that, but we do have new minds. And that means that we can live with one another and treat one another peacefully. We can act in faith, in joy, self-control, hope. We can be hopeful. We can work together in ways that are productive for the flourishing of other human beings and for ourselves. We can, do all of the fruits of the Spirit, and we don't have to hurt each other. We don't have to. We actually have warrant to act ethically, positively. Even though I was talking kind of a bit dismally about the situation of being under the control of sin and in the flesh, and being under the control of certain powers, we have the mind of Christ as well that we're acting out of too. So that's Paul's kind of way of navigating that overlap of the ages, is that, yeah, we are, in the flesh. We are under the control of sin in a certain sense that, damages and harms. But we have this thing. We have one foot in the muck and the mire. We have one foot in this resurrected reality as well. And we can hope and live out of that resurrected reality here and now. Paul has no doubt about that, which is why he has really high ethical expectations for his communities. If it were just that, we're enslaved, what ethical, instructions could Paul actually give his communities? Well, none that would be fair to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, it's really important. Yeah, and that, like, it's really the only way to make sense of having high expectations with, like, this, like, just in, like Paul talks about, this just like absolute enslavement to sin. But yeah, it's the only real way. Like, either he's just like expecting way too much but knows that people can't do it, or there is this overlap, and we really
which would just the former would just set them up for failure, as Doug was talking about in the last the last stream we did on the book. Like, it's just gonna set people up for failure, because it's saying you need to be doing this even though you can't really. And Paul would just be a bad missionary at that point.
Or it would lead us to or it would lead us to have to read Paul in a way that, like, is more like these teachers that you were getting at, where
that's
like,
exactly right. That's exactly right.
More,
and we'll get there in the book. It'll be fun.
I think the way so just kind of like to wrap things up, I think it's really cool the way you guys kind of laid out this section of the book as just like we've said a few times, like really just giving you what your guys' account of love and truth and the salvation and, like, basically the gospel right up front, and then getting into the more like other views and like comparing and contrasting and whatnot. So it'll be cool because I've been reading this just chapter by chapter and we were talking about it. So I think it'll be cool to kind of go back to the beginning, and I'm sure you guys reference and whatnot, but whatever, to kind of think this through. But like just kind of see like, oh, okay, so they were saying it, and then you're right. Like, this actually does contrast with what, the whole justification, but it makes a lot more sense. So I think, so I'm really excited to kind of keep going through that. But yes, I hope this was a good little summary. And as once the book actually is out and people have it and are reading it, I think this will be cool. And kind of, oh yeah, this is what they were talking about here. And yeah, there's a lot more in the book than we've talked about here, but I think we've done a pretty good job of kind of touching on the different parts and stuff, and expanding on some, touching on some things a little more here than and going down some of these rabbit trails we go down. I think are good to kind of, because that's where, I mean, hopefully as you're reading this book, I think a book of this level is really really good to like it's really like makes people think, like I think sometimes like we went through Bruce McCormick's book, that's a was very in depth and whatnot. And a lot of times I'm like, the whole time I'm reading something like that, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
And with something like this,
Yeah.
I'm like, it's just a lot of like ideas that you're just kind of putting more pieces together that I already understand, and it allows you to kind of read and your mind starts thinking and putting more pieces together and whatnot. So there's and I've said this before, I think there's place for all kinds of levels of scholarship and books and stuff like this, but I really appreciate ones that really, like you guys are doing. You're getting at the gospel, you're getting at what matters, and I think, yeah. So I hope these first 3 chapters that we've gone through have gotten people interested and want to read more, because there's definitely more in the book than we've touched on, and all the footnotes and whatnot, where you really, because there are even footnotes in these chapters that kind of get into the weeds a little bit, so that we haven't touched on. But yeah, so to kind of wrap things up, just on this section, we got some questions and stuff to get to. But yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything.
No, I'm just
Kinda-
thank you for that. Yeah, we hope it's clear, like the book is clear and people can follow along with it. And yeah, I mean, if you can't communicate this, if you can't communicate the gospel well to somebody else, then you probably don't understand it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, just to even say that, like, I think it's like weird that sometimes in like churches and whatnot, it's almost like not so, like, I know like we want to say like the gospel is, it seems like if they simplify it in a way, it comes across as like this just like not what you guys are getting at all. It's just, you got to recognize that you're sinful and then you choose to be saved, blah blah blah. That's the simplified way, but then like questions come up right away, right? Like, how does this make sense? And people, I think people struggle to communicate it unless they're like basically reading a script almost. But I think you're understanding here, like, okay, it's a story of what God does. We see, like, he's told us what he does. We saw it, like, like Jesus, we confess all these things about Jesus. Yeah, I just think this makes so much more sense. But yeah, and we can, oh geez Louise. Okay, well, John might have to go, so we can definitely do questions, and we've hit on the book. So, and like we said, we want to keep these a little more concise. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know, like I said, you kind of said your closing thoughts. I'm really happy. I'm happy. We'll be doing, I think our next podcast episode probably won't be on the book. We'll probably try and separate those a little bit, but yeah, we'll see. We'll keep, if you want to keep up to date, the best place to follow us is on Twitter. We post on there a decent amount, and I'll definitely give a heads up on what we've been doing. And I've been looking back at some, just as we close off. If you're interested, you really like, if you're maybe new here, there's a lot of older videos on the channel that are really really good. I've been kind of going back and like adding thumbnails and doing like some posts about them, and it seems like people, maybe didn't see them originally or whatnot, and they've been getting some views. So yeah, so if you're interested, I know one I was gonna post about soon is, you have that review you did of Bonhoeffer Metaxas book. I think is really good and got a lot of views when you first did it, and there's been a lot of new people to the channel. So there's that. There's all those in brief videos that you did are kind of like, it's really interesting. I think as I was looking back at some of the videos, it's interesting to see those. It's like, you can, if you really like pay attention and look on the channel, you can see like the development of the book, basically like go from these ideas you had and all these in brief, and then they kind of get expanded on to what we're doing here. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that that's actually available online. But yeah, so if you like what we're doing here, definitely check out some of our older videos and give this one a like, subscribe to the channel. We got our Patreon, patreon.com/ Apocalypse here. But yeah, we did a really good job. We kept this under an hour, and we talked about the whole chapter, and we even had some rabbit trails a little bit. So I'm pretty proud of. Maybe we're getting
Me too.
a little better.
Getting
at
better.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah. But cool. So thanks everybody, and this has been Apocalypse here.
Christianity you can live with.